My base, my home now, is in France at a beautiful 12th century founded monastery called Bonnevaux. It was a place of contemplation until the French Revolution, and then it passed into private hands. So for 600-700 years, in fact, even longer before that, there was a tradition that it was a place of retreat for hermits at the peak of their spiritual journey. So when I first visited it, there was this very powerful sense of encounter with, I don't know, an energy. I sort of sensed it as a monk myself. I sensed it as a place of monastic life, and many signs of that, although only one wing of a cloister, of the original cloister. And when we first saw it at a certain distance, I would say we fell in love with it. It really seemed to answer the practical requirements we were looking for in our international center for the WCCM. But as we walked closer to it, I was reminded of the importance of being careful who you fall in love with, because it was obviously going to require a great deal of work. And that was true. 4 years of renovation of the three main buildings, the original abbey, the barn, and the stables, which have become the guest house, and a little chapel, which was the remnant of the church, which was demolished in the early 19th century. So one of the things I learned, and which is why I'm interested in your architectural perspective on beauty, is how to see things through an architect's eyes. We were very fortunate, blessed indeed, to have as our architects, giving all their services for love, DP Architects from Singapore, one of the largest architectural companies in Asia. And Angeline Chan, I think they won a gold award for it later in London. Angeline Chan led the team that brought about a transformation without in any way a diminishing of the original. It was an extraordinary achievement. And I'll just give you one example. When we went into the barn, which has now become our main place of meditation, there was a ceiling, low ceiling. And with my lack of visual imagination, we were wondering how we were going to use the top floor. And we put workshops or meeting rooms and so on in there. And as soon as Angeline came in, she just looked at it and she said, well, we have to take that ceiling out. And it was so immediate and radical and simple. And it has produced a very beautiful sacred space out of what was a barn. And I think that I mentioned that at the beginning of my reflections, because how we see things is, I think, how we encounter beauty, and how we, in a sense, make beauty, or maybe, as an artist would often say, reveal the beauty that is in things. And I'd like to try to connect this idea of seeing beauty, perceiving it, with the wisdom of contemplation. Meditation is the practice of contemplation, and to try to see how this maybe has some particular and urgent message for our culture today. I have been a monk for 40 years, and I have been in many sacred spaces, and each of which could be called a temple, whether it's a synagogue or a mosque or a church or a cathedral or wherever, whatever it might be. And for many years, I assumed that the word temple referred to the building, to the structure, that which can be seen and touched and renovated and improved or changed. And then I realized, with a little bit of help from my etymological dictionary, that the word templum in Latin does not refer to the building, but to the space itself, to the space which was drawn out on the floor by those who would be doing certain sacred rituals. And so the temple itself refers to the space in which a certain kind of activity or human work is done, religious work in this case. Now, of course, within that, in that space, you can build a beautiful building or an ugly building, and then you can pull it down and put up another one. Or if we use that as an analogy, we could say that that space can also be used for intellectual construction, building cathedrals of thought and of philosophy and of ideas held together by a particular faith or culture, which themselves, the ideas that make up this dogma or philosophy, they themselves will change over time. Religious doctrine develops, as Cardinal Newman said. So the importance of that reflection, I think, for our time, where religion, the sacred truth and beauty, are problematical for some people. They're things that don't really exist in themselves, or they're not qualities that can be found in all things. I think it's important because religion has three aspects. There is the intellectual aspect, the ideas which are being constructed and formulated into theories and theologies and philosophies or schools. Then there is also the institutional, which means the hierarchical. You have people who enforce these rules or these beliefs, or protect them, or insist that people pay homage to them and use perhaps these ideas in order to maintain a certain kind of institutional control. And that often leads to a very degraded form of religion. In other words, the idea that the temple is primarily what you build in it. Whereas there is a third dimension of religion, which is the mystical. And without this mystical dimension, these other two dimensions are, at the very least, dangerous. They can take over the whole field of religion, create religion out of things that don't seem sacred at all, maybe like consumerism, or the temple of a big shopping mall that you might go to today. I was in one recently, and I think it wasn't on a Sunday, but it was packed with people worshipping brand names and worshipping consumption, and caught up with the kind of passion for buying that could be associated with religious experience even. In any case, the mystical dimension is absolutely vital for a healthy religion. And I think a healthy religious consciousness, I don't mean just one religion, but a religious consciousness that respects and respects what is true and holy in other revelations, in other faiths. That's healthy religion. But this healthy, true religion can play an enormous role in preventing humanity from descending into the inhumanity and the ugliness and the evil that we see, on our headlines every day. So this brings us to this question of the doors of perception. Blake's famous phrase, of course, that if we could but cleanse the doors of perception, we would see things, all things, as they are. And he says, infinite. In other words, we would see them freed from the normal limitations we put upon them, our own limited perceptions, our preconceptions. So just how do we purify the doors of perception? And this is something that a healthy religion would be teaching. It would use its intellectual and its institutional aspects in order to promote and introduce this way of cleansing the doors of perception. And that's what I would like to come back to meditation as a practice that allows this to happen universally. I was with a group of about 80 children a few days ago who came into a church. They came in very quietly and respectfully and willingly. And I wasn't surprised to learn that they'd been introduced to meditation about 2 years ago. And children by nature love meditation and understand it intuitively and directly. And you don't have to teach children to meditate. You simply have to meditate with them. And in the spirit of true education, you allow them to lead out what is inside of them. And we had a wonderful half hour or so of conversation and about 5 or 10 more minutes of meditation in great stillness and simplicity. So I think meditation is the time-honored and universal way of cleansing the doors of perception. And we best understand what it is about, not by doing PhDs about it, but rather by meditating ourselves and, of course, meditating with children. I'd like to just connect what I would like to say about that to three other great, to three great minds who have thought about the nature of beauty. Beauty is what we see when the doors of perception have been purified. So Simone Weil believed that the two things that pierce the heart, that cut through, as it were, all our barriers and our resistances and our pride, and go to the very center and core of our being, the two things are beauty and affliction, beauty and suffering. And they pierce the heart in the sense that they create compunction. The word compunction means that the puncturing, the opening of our heart. And of course, the fruit of compunction, or the grace that is released through this piercing of the heart, is compassion. But she also understood that with this perception of beauty, there comes a sadness. There is delight in this beauty. Beauty thrills us, delights us. But it also is associated with a certain kind of sorrow. And for her, in her very incisive and extreme perception, beauty, as we experience it or see it on the surface of things, it creates in us the desire to eat it, to possess it, to include it in ourselves. Maybe that's what lies behind the art world and the fantastic prices that people pay for beautiful things. The commercialization of beauty and art. I will own it. I will have it myself. And she says this is a tragic mistake. And as she puts it, only God can see and eat at the same time. That the human has to learn to see beauty, but not try to possess it, incorporate it. Beauty is, has often been described as the revealing, the aletheia, the revealing of the whole in a part. And it may be a very simple, ordinary, mundane part of a whole. Etty Hillesum, the young Jewish woman who was killed by the Nazis in Holland, when she was, before she had been arrested, she used to walk between the different compounds where her friends and relatives and the fellow Jews were being incarcerated. And she would bring messages and food and whatever else she could bring. It was a horrible time, hardly a beautiful time. But it was during this time, in fact, that in some extraordinary way, her heart was opened. And not having been a religious person at all, she found herself discovering the divine and even giving it that word. And there's a wonderful description of her walking between these two nightmarish compounds one day, and she happened to see a little flower growing out of a crack in the pavement. And she stopped and was enwrapped by its beauty, totally enwrapped by its beauty. And with that experience, and many others of its kind, I suppose, she went to visit her fellow Jews who were in great distress, great affliction, and great fear, and also in great hatred of the soldiers who were imprisoning them. And she spoke to them, not, I think, making a sermon, but she spoke to them about the lack of wisdom in that. As the Dalai Lama has said, he spends some time every morning practicing the art of forgiveness towards the Chinese for having invaded and destroyed his homeland. And he said, if I allowed myself to hate my enemies, who would suffer, me or my enemies? And it was actually that same wisdom that Etty Hillesum shared with her fellow doomed Jews, and they rejected it. They rejected it as well as impossible or inappropriate, and I didn't think she didn't argue, but she could see the truth of what she was saying, and they could not see it. In other words, she could see the beauty of that response, that moral response, if you like, to a tragic and awful affliction and injustice. She could see that there was a beauty in not hating them and in treating each of the soldiers as a unique individual, not labeling them all, as it were. Now, that same quality in her perception that enabled her to see the flower and the sublime beauty of the flower. Blake has another poem about that, to see the world in a flower, also enabled her to live and see the beauty of forgiveness, or maybe forgiveness isn't quite the right word, but of understanding and of not allowing oneself to be dragged into hatred. So when beauty manifests itself, it's as if something of a wholeness that we cannot imagine or conceive, but something of the wholeness, we might even call it God, is manifested in one part or one moment or one gesture. And this always comes to us whenever we experience beauty, with a sense of gift, of grace, of something unearned, and with a sense of surprise and wonder. And it brings with it a delightful sense of completion. This little taste of the whole in a part gives us a sense of being complete, at least while the beauty moment lasts. So just end with one more thought of Simone Weil, which brings it into maybe a more mystical, but also in a sense a more sociological perspective. She describes the beauty of the world, as a labyrinth. We have a labyrinth at Bonneau, based on the labyrinth in Chartres Cathedral. All the great cathedrals of Europe had a labyrinth of some kind in them during the Middle Ages. And in the 18th century, they were mostly removed or treated as not serious anymore, not rational enough. And a labyrinth is different from a maze. A maze, like the maze at Hampton Court, is where you get lost. And the thrill of it is the fear of getting lost and trying to find your way out. But a labyrinth is totally different, although it may look a little different. First of all, there's only one entrance to a labyrinth. And secondly, you can't get lost. All you have to do is to follow the path. Externally, if you look down on the design of a labyrinth, it almost looks like the human brain, the two hemispheres of the brain, almost exactly the same. But so you go into this labyrinth and you think you're going to go straight to the center, which is where you want to go. And you get very close to the center. There's just a little membrane separating you from the center. But then you go back and you loop and loop back, loop forward. And eventually you're taken right to the very edge of the labyrinth, and you go over to the other side of the other hemisphere. And then you repeat this looping journey back. And it has an extraordinary effect upon the mind as you do it. It's a wonderful little meditative practice. It's good, maybe a good preparation for meditation. And at some point you may think to yourself, oh, this is terrible, I'm going to get lost in here. Or I've taken the wrong turn. But all you need to do is to keep to the narrow path. And the narrow path takes you almost back to the entrance, and then it loops into the center of the labyrinth with a very short little connection point. So a labyrinth is a beautiful symbol, perhaps, of the journey of the mind to what is called the center or the heart in many traditions. So Simone Weil describes beauty as being like a labyrinth. And she says, not in the least sentimental, she says that when we find our way to the center, which we will if we just keep going, we will find God at the center. And then God will eat you. And you will be changed. Letter to the Hebrews says, it is a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the living God. So the experience of God, in other words, is an experience in which our sense of separate identity is dissolved, transcended. And then the person who gets to the center of the labyrinth goes back to the entrance. And then this wonderful detail of her metaphor, they will stay near the entrance and direct others into it. So this intensely personal, individual, in a sense, human experience is not just for the individual who undergoes it, but produces the desire to lead, to help others in the way that Etty Hillesum was doing, for example, to be of service to others and to direct them into the same journey. So those are some reflections, some of them drawn from Simone Weil. Simone Weil, of course, was very influenced by Plato. And Plato, beauty is very central to Plato's philosophy. Beauty for him is not so much a quality of something, but the pure form or the essence, the real thing of everything. It would be perhaps comparable to the verse in the book of Genesis and the account of creation, when God, the master architect, the master artist, had produced the beautiful world, and then he looked at it. He saw, again, this important metaphor of seeing. He saw that it was very good. Saw the essential goodness in everything. So beauty is the secret, not hidden, but the secret essence of all things. And it is manifested in sense of harmony, and proportion, of symmetry. It produces delight and a sense of awe, a sense of wonder. Whether that is the beauty of a landscape or the beauty of a human body. It always strikes me that when we look at a beautiful landscape, and I'm surrounded by beautiful landscape here in West Cork, it's almost as if one's looking at a body. The curves and the arrangement of the elements of the landscape always give me a sense of a body. So when we perceive beauty, and the actual experience of beauty, the actual perception of beauty is in the moment, brings with it the sense of surprise and delight, but also a certain sense that we cannot possess it. And this is perhaps why beauty and goodness, for Plato, are essentially the same thing. We cannot possess goodness. We are good. We cannot possess beauty. We are beautiful. And yet there is something within us, whatever we may call it, which desires to possess it, to control it, to have it. And therefore, in order to truly enjoy beauty and to be good, we have to practice renunciation. We have to renounce the desire of ownership. And I think it's in this that we also touch into the pure religious impulse, which is devotion, surrender, and joyful renunciation. The first of the Beatitudes in the list of Jesus's program for happiness is, "Happy are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God." And poverty of spirit sounds, perhaps because of the word poverty, something rather negative, in the same way that the Buddhist idea of sunyata, or emptiness, suggests something negative. We wouldn't want to be driving a car with an empty fuel tank, and we wouldn't want to be having to face poverty if we're trying to feed our family. So, but these words, of course, are used not to describe a literal condition, but a poverty of spirit is a state in which we are no longer trying to possess. And therefore, it is a state in which we are able to receive. And unless we're in this receptive mode, which is not easy to reach, it's not passive, but if we're not in this receptive mode, then how do we experience gift, grace, pure, unconditional goodness, kindness? So this poverty of spirit is necessary for us to be able to receive the pure gift. Now we come back to this. Another beatitude of Jesus is, "Happy are those with a pure heart, for they shall see God." So we're come back to this metaphor of vision. And I think to understand it, we have to make a distinction between looking at something, which suggests that you're objectifying it, and assessing it, and deciding whether you want it. So looking at something, or seeing. And seeing is more than looking at. It's just seeing into that pure form or essence, which is beautiful and good in itself. In all the great traditions, there are three levels of perception. There is the physical eye. There is the eye of the mind, which allows us to think about and come to judgments about what we see and handle the data of what we are perceiving through our sense, our visual sense. But there is also the eye of the heart. And I think this is the purity of heart that Jesus is talking about in this beatitude. So what is the difference between those three modes of perception. The first two modes of perception, the eye of the mind, the eye of the body, and the eye of the heart, involve objectification. You are looking at something, whether it's a physical object, a person, or whether you're looking at your ideas about it or feelings. But with the eye of the heart, we are no longer in that subject-object dichotomy. There is a sense of seeing as participation. So Plato believed that beauty depends upon simplicity, which was very much Einstein's idea that the pursuit of truth and beauty is what allows us to remain a child. If we're truly seeking beauty and truth, it will keep us young. It will keep us innocent, keep us pure, keep us receptive. These are the qualities of the child. And yet we know that as we leave the Garden of Eden, we become more complex, more self-conscious, and we carry a lot of baggage from our past. And this is why, this is also why it's very important to teach meditation to children, because it enables us to remain more of a child without losing the innocence, I think, entirely. But for most of us, if we come to a serious contemplative practice a little later in life, maybe even on our deathbed, we are doing what Jesus also tells us to do, that we cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. This is this perception of beauty and goodness by co-naturality. In other words, it's our own beauty and goodness which is enabling us to see the beauty and goodness of everyone, even our enemies, that we cannot enter this state of perception unless we become like a little child. And this is what contemplation means. And our culture, our society, our world has pretty much lost the appreciation of the wisdom of contemplation. And we become very left hemisphere. And when Dostoevsky said, "It is beauty that will save the world," it sounds a little trite or a little naive, until I think we realize what we have to do in order to experience beauty. And this, what we have to do, the path that leads us to this, through the labyrinth, is taught with quite remarkable consistency across all the great wisdom traditions. And we need to rediscover the wells of wisdom, of ancient wisdom, or perennial wisdom, in around us, for example, in the sacred texts of the great religious traditions. We need to drink from these wells and to put this practice into our lives again in some healing and liberating way. So my remarks have been a bit labyrinthine, but I hope they've got to the point. And I'd be very interested in your reflections and comments or corrections. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There were a couple of points. You referenced three great minds, and I wondered, you spoke of certainly one, and Plato. Could you conclude that contemplative moment?
Well, the three I mentioned, I only gave a brief moment on stage to Dostoevsky, but it was to bring well, Simone Weil was and Plato in particular, and Jesus. So maybe four.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sure there are many questions, so I wonder where we can begin. José, please.
Yes, thank you, Father Lawrence, so much for your very kind and generous contribution to our own reflection on this subject. And you began, without wishing to paraphrase your presentation, with the space, the templum, that where the building can then be built, whether that is an actual building or a cathedral of thought, as you described it, a cathedral of ideas. And somehow I'm tempted to see this space very much in line with the space that you didn't need to allow for the perception of the beautiful to come about. And I'm reminded, or I was reminded as you spoke, of both, say, the Buddhist approach to perception, of which I know very little, and so I shan't say much, but the need to cleanse, to clean, and to allow that emptiness to take place, but which then is also expressed in different terms in our own tradition, in John Cassian, where we need to really lift the weight from the soul so that it naturally flows back to God like a feather. A very minor marginal note in Cassian. Cassian likens the human soul to a feather. The feather, when it's wet and weighted down by sin, by distraction in particular, then of course it can't fly, it can't be driven away by the wind. But if it's dried up from that weight, then it's easily carried. And in that line, when you spoke of the beauty in art, in architecture, music, it was implied. One of the thoughts in my mind was whether we listen, say, to music in particular, or we listen to architecture, for instance, still too much in line with those categories which we've inherited from the 19th century, a taste, a judgment, style, which in a sense come between us and the perception of beauty in the way you were describing it. And I was wondering, of course, then what is the right way of listening to, say, a 19th century classic, or what is the right way of actually looking at a cathedral beyond those categories? I think you've mentioned something later that somehow puts us in the right direction when you described two things that Simone Weil said: cut through to the heart, beauty and affliction, leading to compunction, and then finally compassion. In compassion, of course, there is an understanding of the thing seen, and more importantly, of the person seen or heard, which brings us into an understanding of that unity you later described. That is also not foreign to a certain tradition of Zen Buddhism and so forth. But we're still in the domain of what you described as appreciation. I wonder if the compunction, the compassion that can be inspired by music, and there are so many. In particular, the different tones of Gregorian chant, for instance, give us a different moods, as it were, that accompany the psalms and so forth. Is it not possible for that to be also the case with architecture, in the making of architecture itself, in the practice of architecture? So I suppose my question, or the one of the many questions, would be, how do we move from the perception, from the degree of appreciation, as you mentioned, as an exercise of meditation, into an active meditation? How do we move from the ora to the labora? How does the work become in itself a prayer?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Cassian. Cassian is the predecessor, or the teacher, in a sense, of Saint Benedict. And Cassian is spent 20 years or so in the Egyptian desert, practicing the teaching of the early Christian monks, and then brought the wisdom of the desert to the Western Church in the beginning of the 5th century. And his teaching can be summed up, really, I think, in the idea of pure prayer. And this was controversial even at that time, and in what we think of as the peaceful deserts of Egypt, there was a lot of controversy over the validity of this approach to prayer, in which we renounce all the riches of thought and imagination, he says. So he gives he passes on what he had received from the oldest fathers of the desert, who themselves said they'd received it from the apostolic fathers, insisting on the lineage and the antiquity of the tradition. That all forms of prayer, now we can think of, as long as we stop thinking about prayer as just petition and intercession, or even praise in the formal, organized, liturgical sense. But if we think of prayer as, well, let's say Origen in the 2nd century described it, and I think it's the best definition. He says, prayer in itself is good. So like beauty, it's good in itself. Prayer in itself is good. And then he says, it calms the mind, it reduces sin, and it produces good deeds. So the calming of the mind, as millions of people are experiencing mental anguish and mental illness today, they go in search of mindfulness or other methods to calm the mind. And so it calms the mind, it reduces sin, which I think we could interpret as shrinking the ego, this inflamed sense of separateness and competitiveness and isolation, which produces in itself its own illnesses and loneliness. And then thirdly, it produces good deeds. It doesn't necessarily produce do-gooders, but people from whom their normal daily activity emanates goodness. They're nice people to be around. That's what the Dalai Lama says, my religion is kindness. So just nice people. And so I think this understanding of prayer is what we desperately need to regain across all religions, really. And it is what will give the common ground that we need. So Cassian brings back this understanding of pure prayer and describes it in the 10th conference is in this as being achieved or being entered into by this very simple method of meditation in the repetition of a single sacred word or phrase. He calls it a formula in Latin, a mantra. And by the simple repetition of this single verse, he says, we renounce. Remember, I was speaking about the need for renunciation in order to relate to beauty without trying to possess it. So we renounce all the riches of thought and imagination and come with ready ease, he says, to that first of the Beatitudes, poverty of spirit. So Cassian is one of the first great teachers, really, of a method of, well, in writing. I think this was passed on as an oral tradition for a long time, of course. So I think, in a way, that addresses one of the points you were making about how do we relate this apophatic prayer, in which we renounce thoughts, words, and images, to the other ways of appreciation and indeed of praise or of delight in seeing physical beauty. And I think there's no contradiction between them. That provided we see that every day and every human life is composed of different dimensions, and each of those dimensions has its own particular needs, which must be respected, like food and exercise and intellectual conversation and so on. So provided we see that there is a need in us for this experience of pure prayer, we will then find not that it contradicts the manifestations of beauty that we enjoy in the world, quite the reverse. We'll be able to see, in line with what you were saying, for example, the relationship between beauty and architecture, and between music and architecture. And when we look at the great, some of the great buildings, and maybe all the great buildings, I'm not an expert on it by any means, but when I'm in Chartres Cathedral, or my own monks have a care of a beautiful church in Florence called San Miniato. San Miniato is one of the most beautiful, complex, and yet incredibly harmonious buildings I could imagine. And it's very carefully, mathematically, and musically constructed. So I think that perception of how beauty across different arts can reveal itself as essentially the same reality and perceptible in other forms. I think that is something that comes from the habit of contemplation or the development of a contemplative mind. And when you see, I lived in San Miniato for some time. We had a meditation center there, and I would see the tourists pour in certain times of the year by the coach load, and how much they were really able to enjoy it, I don't know. Maybe some of them did, I can't judge, but the impression was that they were ticking off something on their itinerary. And so the tourist mind, which is looking for fame and success, I've seen something famous, and they say it's very beautiful, that doesn't open us to the real beauty. It doesn't do any harm to the beautiful, although it may, because it may create an insensitivity, commercialism, which then says, well, it's a nice building, but it's very valuable real estate. We could put up another 20 or 30 floors here and make a lot more rental income out of it. So I think that what your reference to Cassian is, for me, is very apropos of what I was trying to say about the the reason that the working on our way of perception is so important for the kind of life we live, but also for the kind of world we create.
Thank you. Thank you so much. If I could impose on you just a very small question, hopefully not too onerous one. You mentioned that there are things then that eventually get in the way of beauty, that interfere, that don't necessarily harm it, but could. I think going back to Cashin, of course, those would be the distractions. And my question then would be, is it possible that for there to be useful distractions? For instance, when we are often, to give you a very obvious example, often when we have to do a series of chores, a series of tasks which would be cumbersome, difficult, or even painful, sometimes listening to music or some listening to the radio, something quite prosaic like that could be a relief. Your thoughts, please.
Well, when I was learning yoga from a very good yoga teacher, I said to her once, why all these different poses? And she said, well, actually, it's probably true. You could have less, but it would be boring if you just did the same pose every time. I don't know if that's 100% true, because the body itself needs to be stretched and exercised in different directions, in different ways. I think distraction is different from variety or diversity. We are complex. We're made up of many parts, and each of them has its own rights, as it were, and we need to respect those. And I think that is true of the mind as well. The mind, in order for the mind to be focused, it needs a certain variety of stimulation, and also time just to relax. I have a friend who's a classical violinist, and he I was in a car with him once, and he was just listening to pop music on Radio 2 or something, and he's quite capable of relaxing, as it were, in a much less sophisticated or beautiful form of music. So distractions are different. Distractions are volitional attempts to avoid the work of perception. That just came up with that, but I think it sounds okay. In other words, we're frightened. And meditation for many people is quite frightening because of its stillness and the silence at first. So that's why they have to be introduced to it gently in some cases. Children, on the whole, are not frightened of it at all. They love it. They love being still. But for many people today, because we've got so acclimatized to constant noise, constant and constantly changing stimulation. So I remember as a child coming to Ireland and watching the television, and even then Irish television, now it's the same as anywhere else, but there would be pauses between the programs, so give you a couple of minutes maybe to go and make a cup of tea, or just to tune out. And then similarly at 6 o'clock every evening, they would have the Angelus. which is a traditional Catholic prayer that time of the evening, with the bell sounding from somewhere, and then the evening news would follow immediately. So our media saturated minds, have lost that familiarity with pausing, with resting, and with a slower approach to it. And then finally, behind the distractions, I think we have to see what the desert teachers call the demons. And the demons are not they were very sophisticated psychologists with a slightly different language from today, but they weren't imagining that there were all these external demons who were around trying to do us harm. They recognized that they were seeds within ourselves of negative, or what do they call them, obstructions, negative faults. These became the 7 deadly sins, things like lust, greed, and gluttony, and pride, and so on. Now, the desert mothers and fathers who were concerned with the walking the labyrinth to the center recognized that that these states of mind could arise within you because something would stimulate a seed of lust or vanity or laziness and so on. And they didn't associate these so much with guilt, as later became the idea that these states were guilt. You were sinful, therefore you were guilty. It was your fault. They recognized they were more therapeutic about it, and they simply recognized that there were universal tendencies, which could be, for which there were cures, or there were remedies for controlling them, and essential of which was pure prayer, but also they had wise teachings on how to handle anger, for example. And for example, they told the story of a monk who was constantly erupting in anger with his fellow monks. And eventually he thought he just had to leave and go away and be at peace by himself. But very quickly, he realized that the anger was still inside of him. And without the help of others, he would be self-consumed by this uncontrollable anger. So he returned to the community. So there was a wisdom in understanding, and I think how to handle those demons. And I think that willed distractedness, what T.S. Eliot calls distracted from distraction by distraction, that willful volitional distractedness is often linked to a certain fear of facing the demons within ourselves.
Thank you so much.
Could I ask for others? I know time is limited, so it would be very good to hear from others if they have questions at this point. Peter, please.
Well, thank you very much for that, and I certainly share its values and certainly wish more of the world were listening to you. At the same time, I'm curious about one thing, and I would like to pick up both what José was talking about a kind of well-intentioned practice and what that has to do with meditation, and his opening observation regarding your characterization of templum as a space for ritual. And I don't want to go off into sacramental and all of that, though we could, so much as it's securing that centrality is over against a world, or the rest of the world, that isn't like that, doesn't offer those possibilities of communication. Mysticism has a similar quality, in that there's a kind of renunciation of the world for the sake of what you're calling beauty. And I might reframe that as characterizing what we have common to all with the characteristics you give it, such as Plato's term highest good. And to bring our friend Cassian back into this, I wonder if his characterizations of the four levels of interpretation or of analogy doesn't offer a way of thinking something other than a dialectic between the purity of this meditative stance and the impurity and chaos of the world filled with Donald Trumps and so forth, let alone distractions like a shopping mall, that begins to accommodate something like José's notion of good practice. I mean, which obviously for Aristotle was the key term for ethical wisdom.
I think what it strikes me as reminding me of is the the universal wisdom of the middle way, and the virtue is found in balance and harmony. And this is why beautiful things or beautiful people express this sense of balance and moderation, which we conspicuously have abandoned as the COP28 meeting is dealing with the consequences of our lack of moderation. I think moderation means that there's no rule for that almost, because there's no single definition or legislation for achieving the middle way, because it needs constantly to be recalibrated and we could constantly drift into an extreme or into a denial of what is right and necessary in that particular situation. So we need constant, as the Gospel of Advent reminds us, it's about being awake, being fully conscious and alert, and responsive to the particularities of each situation. So that middle way of the narrow way of the gospel, the middle way of the Buddha, I think it ties in with what you're saying about the different levels of interpretation of scripture that we find in the early church. It goes way back, doesn't it? Of course, Origen is one of the first formulators of it, but the allegorical approach to scripture, which of course avoids fundamentalism, but also recognizing that each, well, in his case, he hardly left any verse of the Bible uninterpreted, sometimes a little forcibly, but generally in the important passages, you do move clearly from the literal, the historical, to the moral, and then eventually into the spiritual, 3 or 4. So the interesting thing is that becomes much more experiential when you read a scripture passage with others. I find, anyway. Reading it on one's own, I suppose we do tend to go for the deepest level, and to and to see what it is revealing or teaching us. An extraordinary thing is about great work, great sacred texts, is that you can go back to the same text in infinite number of times and still find them fresh and still find them capable of opening you and reading you in a way. I'm doing an online, giving an online course at the moment on called The Space Between Words, which is about how to try to recover the lost art of reading sacred texts. And it seems to me that when we read a text with a small group of people, it is extraordinary how those different layers or levels of meaning reveal themselves in the conversation. And of course, it's also an occasion in which people would reveal themselves. And for example, a passage I really like to use with a small group is the parable of the kingdom of heaven is like a man who found a treasure buried in a field. He buried it again, and for sheer joy went and sold everything he had and bought the field. But you couldn't have a shorter key into the kingdom of heaven than that. And yet a group of people sharing their responses to that with a few questions just to get them going could be happily talking about it for a couple of hours. And just the question, for example, why did he bury it again? That reveals a lot about the individual. Somebody may say, well, it's because he doesn't want anybody else to find it. And in fact, the answers we might give to certain questions about these texts reveal things. I don't mean in this sort of a guilty sense, but they reveal things about how we get stuck at certain levels of interpretation. And then when we hear somebody else interpreting it differently, we can see our limitations and we let it go and we can drop to that new level of perception. So the word of God is alive and active, without any doubt, if you give it a chance. I mean, unfortunately, the way we read it in church or probably in mosques and synagogues often is more mechanical than that. But and it is also very helpful anyway that these texts are familiar to us, that we've if not grown up with them, at least we have absorbed them and maybe memorized some of them even. That makes them easier to read in this way. Thank you. I think there was a Christian, I think.
Yeah.
Comment.
Hi, yes, thank you. I really enjoyed the talk, and I was interested by the way in which you were talking about various ideas that became spatial, and this is not unusual within the Bible as well. There are certain metaphors that underpin certain relationships, and then talking about Simone Weil and the entrance to the waiting at the entrance to show people the way into the labyrinth. I was reminded of the way you were describing the labyrinth of Plato's cave, the simile, and the idea that he talks about, but he doesn't talk about an entrance so much as two places. And equally within meditation, it's not like a departure and arrival, but almost a places you're moving between places. The actual places aren't necessarily destinations, but the way you described it made me think of, and it's phrased differently, and it's a maybe it's a bit of a mundane question, but do you think the entrance, in the way that the doors of the perception and the way you might say Simone Weil is waiting at the entrance to the labyrinth, is the same as the exit? Are those two things in terms of the door the same thing, or are they different depending on the different states or the different directions of travel?
Well, that's subtle. As I said, the difference between a maze and a labyrinth is a labyrinth. A maze has lots of different entrances or exits, which are difficult to find, but from the inside. But the labyrinth only has one entrance, which is also the exit. It is curious because when you do the labyrinth and you get to the center, then I think you're quite likely to feel I've done it, and I feel better for having seen it through and arrived here, and my mind is calmer. I feel more peaceful. Now, I think that I don't know if there is a protocol for this, but you can either just walk out. Okay, you just walk across. You cut across all the different. It's like oncoming traffic. You just get out of the labyrinth as quickly as you can because you've achieved it, or you retrace your steps, and you do the labyrinth again as a way out, which of course takes longer, and it would be interesting to compare the feeling of arriving at the center and the feeling of leaving at the entrance, now becoming your way out. So I don't know. I think I think there maybe the way around it is Gregory of Nyssa's interpretation of St. Paul, where he epictasis, which is I'm always going forward. I'm leaving things behind, and I'm always going forward. To find God, no, if we seek God, we will find God. But then to find God is really just means that we're setting out on another search for God. So there is no final arrival point, you know. And yet there are certainly stages that we can perceive and feel, stages of our journey in life, and it's important to have some maps, even when you're starting to meditate. It's not a highly detailed map, but I mean, I think when we introduce people to meditation, we sometimes describe it as number of stages that you pass through. For example, you might feel great enthusiasm at the beginning, and it all seems very easy and enjoyable, and you're getting a lot out of it. And then that initial enthusiasm, what St. Benedict calls the first fervor of conversion, passes, and then you will inevitably, for anything you commit yourself to, I think there were moments where you feel achadia, as the Desert Fathers called it, which is the feeling of disappointment, of failure, or of boredom, or of I'm wasting my time, and in varying degrees. It's and this leads a lot of people to give up the practice, to run out of the labyrinth. But if you persevere through the ascesis, and that's where we need support and encouragement, then we come to what he calls apatheia. And apatheia is literally being without the passions, but by passions he means things like lust, anger, pride, and gluttony. Apatheia, he says, is the health of the soul. The health of the soul. So this is where you feel, this is well-being in modern vocabulary. this is a feeling, an experience that whatever may, in a sense, whatever may be going on around you, or you're in touch with a fundamental harmony, fundamental beauty of your own being. And then he says the fruit or the child of apatheia is agape, boundless love, the boundless love of God. So we could say these are 4 stages, but I think they're cyclical as well. And we in the long term, we will find ourselves going through these stages in varying degrees, and of course, being able to recognize them as well. It may be, well, it probably is very similar to marriage or community. You go through these stages in relationship as well. And, you know, if you St. Benedict says at the beginning of the rule, don't take fright at your first entrance into this life, and don't get frightened and run away at the first obstacle, but hang in there, and then you will learn to run along the way of the Lord's commands with the inexpressible delight of love, sweetness of love. And so I think over time, and this is where, you know, faithful practice, fidelity is more important than the idea of success, that you're being faithful and not succeeding at it. Holiness is not something I'm going to succeed at, but that over time in faithful practice, you come to recognize some of those seasons of your inner life. And, you know, I think one of the, when people are suffering from a very dark period in their journey, and feel very alone and very, very unconsoled, one of the best things to read is St. John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul. It really cheers you up because it gives you the sense that this is part of the process. It's meaningful. What you're going through is meaningful. And this is, I think, very important for us today. I mean, it's, you know, we meet so many people, and there's such a note of despair in the media, and young people feel that the problems of the planet and of politics and democracy and the environment and so on are so intractable that there's no point in doing anything about it. Just wait for the disaster movie to happen. And yet there's another approach, which is, if we could see this anguish that the world is passing through as a dark night in which you don't see the light, but nevertheless can perceive the hope that it is leading to, it is a way of purification, or it's a dying of an old form that will give birth to a new way of life. There's a, I forget who was it who said it, I always forget the name of the person. There is a pessimism of the intellect and an optimism of the will. And I think meditation, you might just meditate for entirely personal reasons. I think you have to fundamentally. But it also leads, I think, to this optimism of the intellect, of the will, sorry.
Thank you. I wonder if I could just ask one question, because your metaphor of the labyrinth, of the delineation of the templum, suggests a certain simplification of spatial experience. I wonder about the question of sort of plenitude sometimes. So when you talk about San Miniato, for instance, I think of the journey not as a moment of threshold into the cave, but actually the journey up and the complexity of the levels beyond planimetric order, or indeed the complexity of the veiling between interior and exterior in something like a Rococo church, which, you know, from a sensory point of view is complex. It is about a lot rather than a little. And I wonder how you react to that in terms of the places for meditation, or indeed the movement from Earth to a world beyond.
One of the elements I think about complexity is it playful? If it communicates probably what the designer or the architect or the artist was intending, a sense of playfulness, joy, and liberty of changing, you know, of creating contrasting and complex forms. That's different from a complexity that becomes heavy and preachy or oppressive. And now, I'm not a great. I'm not that attracted to the Baroque. It's impressive, but I wouldn't like to live in it. But that's, you know, maybe just I can see the playfulness of it in a way, but it doesn't seem to me for me it doesn't take me into that spaciousness that you're talking about. So there may be, you know, different types of stuff, different styles for different people. I mean, for me, the most beautiful environment to meditate in is a simple one, simple in form, but also somehow resonant with intention, like the Romanesque church, you know. Now, I'm always conscious, though, that many of those Romanesque churches were very heavily painted, and so we see them without the paint. But I love that. I love the bareness of it, and the curviness of it, and the simplicity, which is at the same time so sophisticated and confident. It's like meeting a very simple old person who understands everything, you know, and is tolerant of everything. Anyway, I don't know, but either way, space. I absolutely. I've come to feel more and more the importance of the physical environment for creating the optimum conditions. But those optimum conditions, you know, are not necessities. If you think of what people what people were able to achieve in under the most terrible conditions. I don't know if you want to, if we have time to read this poem. I don't know if I can find it now. Not a poem. Yeah, do you? Okay, if you just give me a second. Who was it who sent it to me? It was at the class last night. I was doing that. Oh dear, who was it who sent it? Mark, somebody. It was he read it out. You probably heard it, but I couldn't remember it. I'm going to search for it. Anyway, as I. Here we are. Okay. So it was a prayer that was found written in Ravensbrück concentration camp. I think this actually expresses a lot of what we've been talking about. It's quite short. It says, "O Lord, remember not only the men and women of good will, but also those of evil will. But do not remember all the suffering they inflicted upon us. Remember the fruits we have borne thanks to this suffering, our comradeship, our loyalty, our humility, our courage, our generosity, the greatness of heart which has grown out of all of this. And when they come to the judgment, let all the fruits that we have borne be their forgiveness."
Mm.
Have you heard of it before?
No, and but it does feel like an absolutely, those pauses were terrific, if I may say, and it feels like a very apt moment to say thank you so much, and what an enjoyable hour and a half we've had with your wisdom. Thank you.
Great pleasure to be with you. Thank you, and all good things for the rest of this series that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much.